Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown live stream version. I'm Katie Nichols. I'm a certified instructor for SANS, as well as the Director of Intelligence at Red Canary. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk about the wealth of threat reporting, all of the threat things that have been going on over the past 2 months, especially the last few weeks. So I think that the holidays are definitely over. Adversaries are back. There's a lot to talk about. So if you could join us last month, hopefully you enjoyed the chat with my CTI Summit co-chairs, Rebecca Brown and Rick Holland. That recording, of course, is on YouTube if you want to check that out. But we didn't get a chance last month because we were talking about all the CTI Summit preview to really dive into threat reporting and what's been going on so far this year, some trends, some patterns, just some things to watch out for. So that's really where I want to focus today. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. Lots to talk about as always. First thing I wanted to talk about is stealers, right? We know that stealers are a category of malware that has been around for a while. And we've seen in the past couple months a few newer-ish stealers popping up in prevalence. There's sort of bad news, good news about this. Bad news, new stealers, maybe slightly different behaviors. Good news is a lot of these stealers act very similarly, right? We talk a lot on this show about behavioral analytics, tracking what behaviors the malware does, adversaries do. And the good news is that with stealers, that behavioral approach works really well. So I wanted to highlight a stealer called Radamanthus, and I'll kind of drop links in as I go today. You can check those out in the comments, and we'll compile them later on as well. So Radamanthus, that is how you say it. On my team, sometimes we're like, what is that Rada whatever stealer? Radamanthus, this one popped up a couple months ago, maybe like 6-ish months ago in mid to late 2022. And I think now it's really starting to be used in a lot more environments. If you're ever analyzing Radamanthus, one thing to look for is this kind of weird graphic here, and you can carve that image out of packet capture. So lots of people talking about Radamanthus on the Twitters. Also, Zscaler published a great recent analysis on Radamanthus that recommend checking that out. Again, information stealers, really, really common threat that we see across pretty much every industry, every environment. One thing to point out about stealers, and this is all malware that sometimes can get confusing, it can be useful to differentiate the loader component from the main module, right? The thing that does all the bad stuff, the payload that steals the credentials, etc. So Radamanthus is a little tricky. They try to do some anti-analysis stuff, as many malware families do. But the good news is, right, as that malware is executing, the loader component and the kind of credential stealing component, which is where the bad stuff tends to happen, that's where you can have a lot of detection opportunities. So as you start to read, right, about Radamanthus, you'll find a lot of similarities to all of these other stealer families like Vidar that have been around for so long, right? Information stealers, they try to steal information, cryptocurrency wallets, credentials, browser information, etc. So Radamanthus, definitely one worth keeping an eye out. And if you ever find yourself, you're like, hey, there's a stealer I'm looking at in this environment, and I don't really know what it is. It doesn't quite match any other stealer I've seen. Think about if it might be Radamanthus. So lots of deep dives here in this Zscaler post. But as always, think about, right, the behaviors. A lot of the execution behaviors are very detectable. Other things you can key in on: network communications, right? Some details there. Another thing we've found that sometimes helps with detecting stealers is a lot of them write the same kind of text files, right, with cookies, with passwords, etc. So a couple of IOCs in that blog for those who like IOCs. So Radamanthus, definitely a stealer to watch. I think a couple of people in the community have seen sort of an uptick in that in recent months. Another new stealer, because of course we need more stealers. Yay. One called StealC that the folks over at Sequoia just published a great blog post on. And I really kind of like the art up here. I think that's like a cat. I don't know, a cat or a fox. Someone can correct me there. But again, bad news, good news, new stealer, but it uses a lot of the same code and TTPs as other stealers, Vidar, which has been around for a while, and Raccoon, which has been around for a while as well. So, overview of StealC, and kind of interesting, right? Thinking of the value of different sources. The Sequoia team mentioned that they saw some chatter in different dark web monitoring, right? And then about a month later, started to see this in the wild, right? Actually being used. So seems like adversaries sharing the stealer around, um, being used. And again, the challenges as they talk about, right, very similar to Vidar, Raccoon. One thing my team has found is sometimes we'll see a stealer in an environment and we're like, stealing creds, it's stealing, cryptocurrency wallets. I don't know exactly which one it is. So you might find that same challenge. I think there can be utility in finding the specific malware family, but even if you just know this is a stealer, right? It probably stole credentials. We probably need to reset those credentials. That might be enough depending on your intelligence requirements, what's important to you. So this is an awesome post because it kind of dives into a little bit about the monitoring of the forums, right? Russian-speaking underground forums where they talked about this, but then it dives into the capabilities, right? And this is where, especially if you support those doing detection, might be helpful. Some things like StealC will abuse legitimate DLLs, right? SQLite 3, et cetera. And right, this is something again that a lot of stealers do. So if you start to see module loads or suspicious use of those DLLs, might be an indication of stealer behavior. As all adversaries who are good do, they will also clean up after themselves. So, right, sometimes adversaries are trying to trick us and they're like, cool, we're going to make sure to clean up after ourselves. But as we see, if we kind of scroll down a little bit, that cleanup command, that might be something you could even monitor for, right? We see at the very end of all of their process, they delete, right, a bunch of DLLs from C program data. Like, should there be those DLLs in program data that are being deleted? Maybe, maybe not. So that might be something interesting to kind of key in on here. But a lot of great details here. And what I appreciate is especially the team kind of gave really specific details, right, of the file names that were sent over and exfiltrated, right? This gives us specific examples of, right, the types of information sent about cryptocurrency wallets, for example, right? Different files being exfiltrated. So a lot of these stealers will create text files with the stolen information and then steal them. Sometimes these names will change, but hey, maybe you just go look for default release.txt. Maybe that's an unusual file name on your network, and that might be interesting as well. So different things you can key in on this. But again, the good news is that if you start to write signatures, whether it's network-based, right, lots of great ideas here, or if it's host-based, a lot of those signatures that work for StealC are likely going to work for other stealers as well. Got a question. This webinar is being recorded. Very important question. See lots of folks joining today. Someone else is in Northern Virginia. I know we usually have folks joining around the world. So appreciate we got an aloha, maybe someone from Hawaii. It's pretty warm where I am, so maybe Hawaii-like weather. So StealC, another stealer to keep an eye out for. Yet another one, because of course we need more stealers, a Venus stealer. And this is one that's Python-based. Adversaries like to use different languages when writing their malware. Python is one that we see some stealers, some malware families use. But you notice capabilities, right? Stealing browser data, stealing credentials, stealing cookies, kind of similar types of behaviors. So again, stealers, something that a lot of different teams have noticed have been a very prevalent threat throughout last year, throughout the first few months of this year. And if you think about bad impacts from different threats, like adversaries stealing your creds and then selling them on a dark web forum or abusing those, like that's probably an outcome you want to try to protect against. So definitely a category of threat that is worth paying attention to. So moving right along from stealers. Blog post that caught my eye was this one from Symantec. I don't know if I'm going to say this name correctly. I'm going to go with Chasma, kind of an interesting choice of names. So again, as you're reading open source reporting, think about, is this relevant to you? If If you're in medical or you do shipping, right, that kind of work, maybe this is in your threat model, especially if you're located in Asia. So, what kind of interested me about this blog post, and I really actually appreciate from the Symantec team, is right, they talked about what they observed. Okay, right, targeting of shipping companies, medical labs in Asia, in a likely intelligence gathering campaign. And they say, hey, the actor behind this, we weren't able to link the actor to any previously identified group. But they still came out and put the research out anyways, which I think is awesome. I think as these campaigns first develop, a lot of times organizations aren't able to get to that true attribution, or maybe they can't associate it to any known threat group. But by putting this research out there, right, hopefully maybe some of you watching will take a look at this and be like, hey, we're seeing something similar, can start to piece that together. And what particularly interested me here, again, this theme of different adversaries of different motivations that we've seen using open source tools. We noted they assessed this is likely an intelligence gathering campaign. And whenever you see a motivation of gathering intelligence or espionage motivation, our minds often go to the advanced persistent threat APT term, which I'm not a particular fan of because what does it even mean? In this example, right, these adversaries use publicly available living off the land types of tools. Is that advanced and persistent? I don't know. You choose. But just mimicking this theme that we've seen repeatedly, right, over months and years of adversaries continuing to use, right, open source tools. So a couple of the tools mentioned, and some of these are probably very familiar. Cobalt Strike, we're all familiar with Cobalt Strike by now. Process Dumper. Some of these I wasn't as familiar with, like GoGo scanning tool, right? Allowing the adversaries to kind of learn a little bit about their victims. FScan, right? Dog's proxy tool. But we see the same commonalities of a lot of these tools that are used legitimately by pen testers or red teamers, also used by adversaries as well. So just an interesting note, again, to think about this idea that open source tools pretty widely used by adversaries of a lot of different motivations. So nice little blog post to kind of look at and think about, hey, are these tools that you've seen in your networks or right that you would even know to look for? Of course, things like scheduled tasks, yeah, that's going to be in any Windows network. But good little blog post to take a look at. Think about if you could detect these tools. On the topic of open source and publicly available tools, recent tweet from Jackie, who works at Chain Analysis, I believe, one of the experts I follow on all things cryptocurrency, highlighting a recent advisory that the US government put out about North Korean actors using publicly available tools. And highlighting kind of the cryptocurrency transfer, right? Transfer of a victim to pay for ransomware. You might have seen this one. This came out a couple weeks ago as a joint advisory. Always interesting to kind of see like who signs these joint advisory. And in this case, right, had different agencies from around the world, right? NSA from the US, also the Republic of Korea jointly issued this advisory, which was kind of interesting to see which countries are teaming up. So this one focusing on ransomware from North Korean actors, right? And gives an overview. You might recall last summer, summer in the northern hemisphere, that is, in July 2022, there was a previous advisory on North Korean actors using ransomware known as Maui. And this advisory kind of updates, right, other ransomware activity from North Korean actors. Always good when there are technical details. Map to MITRE ATT&CK TTPs, talking about different ransomware families. Another supplemental blog post, it's great to read if this is in your threat model, would be this one from Microsoft. I think I might have highlighted this in a previous live stream. This is back from July on the Holy Ghost ransomware that is also attributed to North Korean actors. So kind of another good place to look for exact TTPs, right? Things that you might be able to detect. So again, TTP breakdown, and what kind of highlighted or caught my eye here rather is the mention of publicly available tools being used. We've seen this with ransomware that sometimes there's custom ransomware is going to do the encryption, but adversaries have sometimes used built-in publicly available tools or built-in tools in operating systems, BitLocker, etc. I think this is also interesting to think about, right? North Korean actors using ransomware and this note in the advisory that, right, sometimes North Korean actors have portrayed themselves as other ransomware groups, like R Evil, for example. We often talk about the different categories of cyber threats. We're like, oh, state-sponsored actors, like criminally motivated. What do you do when you start to get into North Korean actors who maybe have a financial motivation, but there may be also state-sponsored aspects here? So maybe a little bit more murky. And also just an interesting note here. I think it's kind of fascinating that we let ransomware actors sort of name themselves. I don't know about you, but if I see a ransom note that says, "Oh yeah, this is Lockbit," you're like, "Cool, it's Lockbit." Well, just an important note here in this advisory that, all right, sometimes other adversaries might actually masquerade as a different ransomware group to try to redirect that blame. So, just another thing that can make attribution even more challenging. So, kind of interesting, including some cryptocurrency wallets here. And then, as always, right, mitigation guidance to think about isolated backups, incident response plan, pretty standard stuff. So, interesting kind of advisory to take a look at. And as always, when these advisories come out, important to think about cool, it serves maybe an objective to empower defenders, but also a national security objective, right? To kind of send messages that, hey, the US government and the South Korean government say that this is not okay, right? Ransomware activities from North Korean actors are not something that they want to continue. So again, a little bit of ransomware in there for you, worth a read, especially if ransomware is in your threat model, which I think it's in most people's. All right, moving right along here. OneNote. Let's talk about OneNote. This has been a theme that has been popping up throughout early this year, and there's a really great blog post from the folks over at Proofpoint too. If you're not already following their blog, they have such amazing visibility into email especially, but network as well. And so they're able to see patterns across a lot of organizations and a lot of email targeting. So this blog post is great. Talks about how a bunch of different actors have started to use OneNote, especially attachments for delivering malware. Why? Always hard to make an assessment about why, but really interesting analysis here from the Proofpoint team about how potentially adversaries are changing a little bit based on some changes Microsoft made. Remember that earlier in 2022, Microsoft made changes to block macros from most file types downloaded from the internet. And based on that change, adversaries were like, oh man, we can't use our Excel macros anymore. So we definitely saw across the community adversaries using container files, things like virtual hard disks, ISO files, seen compiled HTML, and now OneNote. And what's sort of interesting to me about OneNote is this isn't necessarily new. OneNote has been around for a while. If you look years ago, adversaries have been using OneNote maliciously, but for some reason, maybe related to different protections Microsoft has put in place, adversaries decided, hey, let's give OneNote a try. So different groups have been using OneNote to deliver different malware families. So important to note that just because you see OneNote, it's not necessarily Qbot or TA577, et cetera. But one group that Proofpoint tracks is TA577, that has been using OneNote to deliver malware. And you see a lot of different malware families have been delivered this way, Redline, Agent Tesla, Quasar, Qbot, a lot of different malware families, which again, if you can figure out how do we detect or remove malicious OneNote attachments, cool, you can protect against all of these different malware families. A lot of bang for your buck, which is kind of nice. So again, lots of details here. Depending on your appetite, if you don't have a legitimate need for people to be getting OneNote attachments to their email, maybe don't allow them in your network, That'd be a more extreme option. Other options, you can also look for process lineage, Should OneNote, for example, be spawning PowerShell. Maybe, I don't know, admins do weird things in network, but potentially not. So looking for weird process lineage, um, things like PowerShell invoke web request, calling out to an external URL or an IP, like maybe not normal in your environment. So lots of things you can do. Again, these are often very detectable and very preventable. So that's a proof points take on it. Very, very prevalent in January. And that's interesting because about a week after they published this, right, two different groups, TA577, which they talk about here, and TA570, started like sending a ton of OneNote attachments to a lot of different organizations. And so we've seen a lot of chatter about OneNote on Twitter. And so I'll just drop in tweets, a couple good people to follow. Twitter is still alive, and I'm very happy about that as a researcher. Max has been sharing a lot of details. Qbot or Quackbot is one malware family that's been delivered via lots of different methods. They used OneNote for a while. I know that Qbot has also been delivered via PDFs. So the different file types keep changing up. But I would say that OneNote, what we've seen so far this year, that is definitely a file type to make sure that your defenders can detect. So a lot of these same living off the land binaries, right? Mishta, as I like to say, compiled HTML files, etc. So a lot of these, again, look pretty compelling for users. So, user awareness training is always a factor here. Not the only thing we should be doing, but user awareness probably wouldn't hurt with these either. A couple other examples, and again, these are great people to follow if you want to keep up to date with what different malware families are doing. Just another example, OneNote containing an embedded batch script. Click to view document, maybe hovering over, like if there's a .batch script, please don't click, but users don't know. So a great thread kind of following through the different stages of that. Another Qbot example. And again, just highlighting, okay, OneNote then spawns cmd.exe and then PowerShell and then run DLL32. Is that normal, right, in your environment? Maybe, maybe not. There's also some specific command lines here. One thing you might find success with is looking for a weird run DLL32 command lines. Sometimes they'll have, right, exports like this CPURT one that are not legitimate, pretty easy to detect. For a while, some Qbot operators were using a wind string for their export name. I think some of them have moved on by now, but earlier in February, that was a unique kind of export that was used. So Qbot's been using OneNote, IcedID as well. Again, this idea that lots of different malware families using the same techniques. So OneLoad payloads, again, and Costas is a great person to follow if you want to track this stuff. Same kind of TTPs afterwards, though. Remote desktop protocol, using Cobalt Strike and exfiltrating things. And then one last tweet that I'll share. So the campaign earlier in February, bunch of adversaries using OneNote, but it was primarily TA570 and TA577 delivering both Qbot as well as another payload known as Matinbucus. And I really appreciate it. I don't know Mad Cat, but I really appreciate their avatar here. Talking about, again, the kind of phases of this, the execution chain. Okay, maybe some kind of malicious HTA is opened after OneNote is opened, and giving some ideas for detection. Suspicious process lineage is a great way to detect this stuff very easily. So again, early 2023, you've seen a big uptick in OneNote attachment use. If you figure out and empower your defenders to detect that, going to be a good use of your time, I think. Adversaries might switch back and forth using different file types, but chances are they're probably going to come back to OneNote at one point. So lots of awesome open source resources you can read. Of course, Unit 42, Brad Duncan, always a great source as well that I've talked about in previous streams. Yeah, and a great comment coming in from Yashil. Could run DLL32 not be legitimate? Absolutely. And that's one of the challenges with all of these kind of living off the land binaries, right? Run DLL32 might be legit. It is used legitimately, but sometimes there are patterns, right? For example, like Should run DLL32 be executing a JPEG with this weird function or export name? Probably not. So that's where, knowing your network, what's the legitimate use of run DLL32 can then kind of help you out, right? Figuring out the malicious ones as well. But great point. And that's definitely a challenge of detecting on these lull bins. But the more you kind of look at these, the more you get a sense of what could be suspicious. And Eric commenting, looks like you're phishing simulations. That's great. That means that you are mimicking the adversaries in a accurate way. I always appreciate a good adversary emulation. All right, moving right along. Lots to talk about. It is annual report season. It kind of feels like it's almost always annual report season, but right as we get into February and March, teams have had time to process all of their data from 2022, come up with different findings. And so I'll just highlight a couple of reports that I really like. There are lots of other annual reports, though, to take a look at. So one that just came out recently, I think it was last week, from the team over at IBM X-Force. They have a lot of visibility. And so it's really interesting, especially for orgs with a ton of visibility. What takeaways did they have? Always nice, even if you don't have time to kind of read every single one of these 58 pages, there's usually some kind of a specific summary. I really liked these metrics that they have, right? Percentage of attacks with extortion, where adversaries try to, right, extort victims, get them to pay, often in exchange for not releasing data. 27%. That's okay, not huge, not over half, but that's a pretty significant percent. I think a good thing to do is, as you're reading these reports, think about, okay, what trends is this organization seeing? And then what actions should I inform with that? Right? This tells me that, okay, 1 in 4 chance if you have an attack, it's going to involve some kind of extortion. So you probably should be prepared to know how to negotiate, right? Have an incident response plan that involves responding to extortion. Something as simple as that. Backdoors being deployed, right? We just talked about a bunch of stealers. Those might be considered backdoors. So, right, worth knowing what backdoors are prevalent in the communities so you can know how to monitor for them. So, a bunch of key statistics here. Some of them might be surprising, some of them not. 41% of incidents that they saw involved phishing for initial access. Often people, in these reports are looking for the kind of shiny objects or what's new or different. But what I found from looking at a lot of these reports is that they kind of tell us what's the same year over year, right? One thing I'm not a huge fan of is making predictions for the upcoming year. But if I had to make a prediction for 2023, I'm going to go out on a limb and say adversaries are probably going to continue phishing to gain initial access. You heard it here first, everyone. But it can be useful just to get information that, yes, this is still a thing that we need to care about. So lots of other interesting breakdowns here. Again, not always the most glamorous or new techniques. How are adversaries gaining initial access? Exploiting vulnerabilities in public-facing applications. We know this. We know everyone needs to patch. Easier said than done. And they use phishing, right? But again, it can be a way to focus. And, if you're trying to get funding or resources or talking to your leadership about where you should be prioritizing your efforts, reports like this can be really helpful. Of course, it's important to note that every organization has limited visibility, right? No one sees everything. But if you start to combine, right, look at what IBM puts out. Many other teams also put out reports. And as you start seeing these commonalities, you can say, okay, definitely these are things that we need to be paying attention to, and we really need to be prioritizing. So kind of a good breakdown. Again, phishing, something really prevalent. Got to pay attention to that. I thought it was interesting they talk a little bit about the spoofed brands. And I think this is significant for defenders, especially. We see a lot of these adversaries masquerading as legit services, but just as a reminder to defenders that just because a domain name contains Microsoft doesn't necessarily mean it's actually Microsoft. And yeah, someone commenting on LinkedIn, seems like extortion has slowly been on the rise. Yeah, and that's where I don't actually know if IBM has a year over year comparison. Might be somewhere in here. But that's another thing that's cool about these reports is kind of looking at what's changed over time. Has extortion risen? Maybe you have a feeling in your visibility it has. This kind of gives you a chance to find some other data. So great report, worth taking a look at there. Another annual report on cryptocurrency. Crypto, I'm going to say crypto means cryptography, but the other cryptocurrency. And the folks at Chainalysis do a really nice job. I think I got it right. It's Chainalysis, not chain analysis. I get it wrong almost every other time. But this is a really interesting one, especially if you don't deal with cryptocurrency every single day. This is a great way to learn more about it, right? And just get up to speed with what's happening in that space. So Chainalysis, I think they do really great reporting on this. It's also interesting to kind of take a look at forces beyond just what defenders and analysts do in the cybersecurity realm, thinking about there are different sanctions that are maybe changing this ecosystem. Then another not really annual report, but sort of a trend document that I found kind of interesting over at Microsoft, talking about identity. And with credit to my teammate Jimmy, identity, I think, is the new thing to think about. As adversaries move from endpoint to network to cloud to SaaS systems, we can't necessarily think about just the malware anymore. Once an adversary has credentials, they can steal my identity, right? Much easier for them to move around. And so I thought this is a neat breakdown and just a high level approach to think about what are the identity attacks? What are the things that are happening in identity? And again, maybe not things that are earth shattering or new. Yes, adversaries might use password spraying, right? Guessing passwords, changing up the account name and trying the same common password like password or admin, etc. Just a nice overview. And again, shifting our, way of thinking to not just let's look for the malware, but let's look for the weird identity patterns, right? Should someone be logging in here? And of course, every time we talk about identity, got to talk about multi-factor authentication as a mitigation. Of course, there are multi-factor authentication attacks, which they outline here as well. But kind of important, you're reducing the attack surface, right, by implementing multi-factor authentication. So I always think of it as like, yes, implement MFA, that's level 1. And then once you have something implemented, then start thinking about the attacks against multi-factor authentication, right? Don't just say like, well, MFA can be bypassed, so I shouldn't try at all. That's not the lesson. So kind of a leveling up here. And again, I was like data. I don't know about you, data-driven decisions make me feel comfortable. And so kind of a nice overview here of the multi-factor authentication fatigue technique. We've seen quite a bit from last year, and I'm guessing will continue this year, right? Where adversaries will keep trying to log in, push those MFA requests, hoping that maybe a user will unwittingly accept it. And I think we can see, right, based on Microsoft visibility, yeah, definitely been kind of an increase in this. So again, just the takeaway from looking at these annual reports being, look at the trends that others are seeing. Chances are if Microsoft is seeing an increase in multi-factor authentication fatigue, that's an indication something that should be an area to focus on. So we will see many more annual reports, and hopefully you will keep an eye on those as they come out. Robert commenting, UEBA has helped monitoring for suspicious behaviors. Yeah, I forget, user behavioral analytics. I kind of put it under that umbrella, looking for, okay, what should this user normally be looking like? And then if there are anomalies in those behaviors. So lots of different approaches there, but it requires a very different mindset, right? Thinking about how do we deal with a compromised identity versus just malware on an endpoint. And I'm sure next month I will be talking about more annual reports as they come out. Might have noticed if you watched the news this week, it has been a year since the war in Ukraine started. I don't know about you, but I was like shocked. I'm like, has it really been going on for that long? And you'll see a lot of different reports come out about, right, what has the last year been like in terms of the conflict in the war and how, right, cyber war has manifested or not. I thought this was a really great report from Google's threat analysis group, as well as support from Mandiant, talking about, right, over this past year, maybe how has this conflict transformed the cyber threat landscape? What have we learned from it? A lot of really great graphics. And, I think a couple themes that I've definitely seen over this year is that there have been a lot of organizations, right? Google, Microsoft, many others supporting the defenders in Ukraine, right? Coming to try to donate resources or enable those defenders because as we've seen, they've gotten hit really, really hard by a lot of cyber attacks. A couple key findings here, right? A lot of this is very much in foreign policy lingos, right? Russian actors have been trying to gain a decisive wartime advantage in cyberspace with mixed results. And I think, one thing to highlight here is it's been a mix of types of operations, right? Some destructive attacks. We've seen a lot of wipers. There have also been hack and leak types of operations. And so, one thing that I take away from this and from the past year is that, right, we can't just focus on one type of thing in cyberspace when we're looking at cyber conflict. A lot of great overviews here, a lot of timelines, right? Talking about, right, different phishing campaigns, how there have been ebbs and flows. And I think it's really interesting to, try to connect across the kinetic world and the cyber world. And are there times when, right, the Russian government was seeking to achieve certain objectives on the ground? And then how did cyber attacks maybe enable that? Or when were they more or less active? Few other interesting breakdowns. I appreciated this one. I believe this is a graphic from Mandiant talking about the different phases. And, again, kind of interesting to see like that early phase, January 2022, a couple of organizations saw, right, espionage, pre-planning, and different malware families doing that. And then, right, when the invasion first happened, kind of a different phase, a lot of destructive wipers we saw, right? You might recall the reporting a year ago on things like Caddy Wiper, right? And then interesting to look at kind of the times when maybe it's a little quieter, right? Maintaining footholds, Mandiant assessing that, right, they were just maintaining footholds. So maybe we didn't see as much reporting about specific wiper activity. And then Mandiant assessing kind of the end of 2022, a renewed campaign. Now, I think one thing that's also important to think about is who has visibility here, right? And I think that when we talked about this a year ago, I remember we had John Holtquist on the live stream, and he talked about, potentially preparing for Russian attacks against U.S. infrastructure, critical infrastructure. You might recall, right? CISA had their Shields Up campaign. And I think one thing that maybe I've taken away from the past year that you might agree or disagree with is that it seems like maybe the attacks haven't manifested outside of Eastern Europe and Ukraine like we anticipated they might. It's not to say that U.S. critical infrastructure hasn't been hit by Russian actors. It certainly has, but I think a year ago there's a lot of uncertainty. Right? A lot of us were like, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how Russian actors are really going to act. Are they going to reprise against anyone who allies with Ukraine? And so, a lot of lessons, I think, to think about from the last year. And of course, also important as we're doing this reflection to note that this is still going on, right? There are people on the ground losing their lives, being affected by this day to day. So, I think as we're doing this kind of analysis and retrospective, important to kind of keep that in mind that this is still going on. So worth a read. This main blog post just has a summary of kind of key themes, right? Again, this idea that Russian actors have used full spectrum operations, right? Not just destructive wiper attacks, but also influence operations, right? Hack and leak, etc. So interesting to keep an eye on this. And again, as always, thinking about what's going on that might affect what you do. Your findings from this report are going to be very different if you were located in Ukraine or Eastern Europe versus if you're in the US or you're in Australia or you're in a different part of the world. All right, some other reports I wanted to highlight. This is kind of an interesting one from Sentinel Labs. I haven't gotten absolute confirmation on this, but I've heard that WIP stands for work in progress. So kind of an interesting report here. New threat cluster. Again, we've talked, if you've tuned into previous live streams, about how different teams have different ways of naming. And WIP26 is this one, assessing it's espionage related, but right, maybe not at a super high confidence level on the true attribution here. So again, thinking about applying, would this apply to you? Well, WIP26 targeting telecom providers in the Middle East. So if you're in telecom, this is probably one that's relevant to you. What caught my eye about this is the use by this cluster of public cloud infrastructure, and also some kind of interesting techniques using Microsoft Graph and Microsoft 365 Mail, which we don't always hear about. So overview here of kind of the group, who they've targeted, etc. But a couple things to highlight. I like this graphic. It just shows, right, how this adversary has used a bunch of different cloud services, cloud providers for their operations. So for example, malware hosting this social MSDN Microsoft at AzureWebsites.net, right? Using that as a malware hosting site, using this next domain as a data exfil site. I don't know about you, if I'm looking in my logs and I'm like, cool, short on time, got a lot to review, a lot of work to do, I might kind of overlook those. So a technique worth paying attention to, right? We know that adversaries like to masquerade as legit things, but again, if you think about, how a proxy might categorize these, okay, it might just be cloud hosting and might be allowed through. Also, some details about some interesting malware that abuses different features in Microsoft 365, right? So if you're not familiar with the Microsoft Graph API, I feel like it's every day that there's some Microsoft feature or log source that I don't really know a whole lot about. But if you do any work with Microsoft, right, learning a little bit of the Microsoft Graph API, right, and the resources you can get from there, the types of logs you can get through there, definitely a useful link from this post. It talks about this malware that they call CMD365, right? And the techniques they use here. A couple of things to highlight. Malware receives an OAuth bearer access token. So OAuth, an authentication method you might be familiar with already. For example, if you're accessing like a new resource and you don't want to have to create an account, you say, oh, just use my Google account or Microsoft account, right? Allow it. OAuth is often doing that authentication. And so some details here about, right, how the adversaries are authenticating to this mailbox using valid credentials, and then creating an inbox folder, which is kind of interesting. This is something we often will see as adversaries get into web-based mail. Sometimes they'll create new folders or do email forwarding rules, that kind of thing. So definitely one worth keeping an eye on. And again, thinking about, do you even have the right monitoring or visibility to be able to detect this kind of thing? So interesting one from Sentinel Labs. Cool. Moving right along, lots of different things to talk about. Wanted to hit on this blog from Zscaler on Havoc, which is another command and control framework. Yes, like Steelers, I feel like it's every day that we have another C2 framework. This one, Zscaler saw targeting a government org, and Havoc is a somewhat newer one, right? There are a lot of C2 frameworks out there. Some like Empire has been around for a while. Havoc, one that maybe we don't see all the time. Because so many adversaries of different motivations reuse these same C2 frameworks, right? Looking at new reporting on these C2 frameworks can be really useful. What I've seen is that, right, the older ones, Cobalt Strike, Empire, etc., tend to be pretty prevalent, but some of these newer ones are starting to, right, rise up. Sliver is one that we've seen a lot of reporting on in the past year. Havoc, I think, will be another one to keep an eye on. So again, frameworks like this sort of in everyone's threat models because of multiple adversaries who tend to reuse them. So worth checking that one out. Another report I saw that I thought was really interesting. This one came out from Microsoft's DART team. And I've chatted with people who worked on this team. Their DART team is really, really good at incident response. And so anything that comes out from Microsoft in general, but especially from the detection response DART team, worth keeping an eye on. And Nobelium is a group that some of you might be intimately familiar with or have heard of, right? They were responsible for the SolarWinds breach. I know it's too soon to even talk about that. But Russian state-sponsored group that does some really, really interesting things. We talked about earlier how, right, some groups will use open source or public tools, right? Some groups like Nobelium do really, really interesting things though. And I thought this is a really, really great breakdown of a really complex intrusion that the team analyzed, right? So if you go to the link that I dropped in, that will take you to this PDF document with some further details here. So breaking out the attack flow of what they call magic web. Accessed gained credentials, right? Credential harvesting, starting with a really common technique, but then some things that, right, haven't happened all the time, right? Adversaries actually implanted a backdoor in the global assembly cache, GAC, which, as I mentioned, there's a lot of Microsoft stuff to learn. Luckily, they have a ton of resources. If you've never heard of GAC, okay, cool. It stores assemblies designed to be shared by several applications on the computer. Cool. Seems like part of Windows, like legitimate thing. Well, right, according to Microsoft, this was actually the first time they've seen adversaries implement a backdoor in the global assembly cache, which is kind of interesting, right? And then another really interesting technique they used here, which again, this is not something that you see every day, right? The adversaries kind of abused how extended key usage attributes are used for authentication. And so they were able to actually bypass traditional authentication. So really interesting, pretty advanced, I would say, techniques here. But what I found really cool was that they talked about how they investigated this. If you've ever done any kind of intrusion, intrusion analysis or incident response, right? You find at the end, you're like, oh yeah, we know exactly how everything happened. But when you're in the midst of it, probably, right, as they were trying to figure out how this adversary got this back door in, they were like, what the heck is happening here? So what I really like in this report is this breakdown talking about, right, the investigative process. And I think it can be really useful. A lot of these things that we do when we're investigating just, right, come to us and we naturally are like, okay, why is this here? Let me question, right? Should I look here next? But this kind of breaks down as the Dart analysts were looking at, okay, is this certificate valid or not? Why was this authentication successful? All right, if it's not valid, is there something unique? What's unique? And then kind of thinking through, well, can we reproduce this? This report talks a little bit about how the analysts tried to reproduce this authentication method and figured out, okay, it's only a specific combination, right? Is this happening just in this environment or could it happen anywhere? Is this a software vulnerability? So I just really liked this kind of investigative process that they shared here. Again, pretty advanced techniques that maybe not every defensive team would be able to figure out, but I think learning from the investigative process can be really powerful as well. So kind of a neat one on Nobelium, just to supplement, some of the techniques we've talked about, the Run DLL32, the OneNote that might be easier to detect. This stuff much harder, but the report also, of course, right, has recommendations for how you can detect and respond, which is always good. And of course, as we've talked about, MFA all the time. All right, moving along to more on the international relations side. So you might have noticed, and I don't know about you, I get really excited whenever this happens. The US Treasury and cooperated with the UK to sanction members of the Trickbot group, the Russia-based Trickbot cybercrime gang. So sanctions came out earlier this month. Again, kind of an interesting combination of international relations and cybersecurity. And a couple people noted in this blog post, right, it gives a little bit of background on Trickbot, this group who uses Trickbot malware, what they've done, how, right, you might recall back in 2020 when the pandemic was really bad, Trickbot hit a bunch of hospitals, partnered with ransomware actors to ransom those hospitals. There's this interesting line that a couple people keyed in on here. Right? Current members of the Trickbot group are associated with Russian intelligence services. You're like, well, that's interesting, but what does associated mean? Kind of an interesting tidbit there, and we'll remain to see if there's a little more detail that comes out on the nature of that association. As we've talked about in previous months, there's a spectrum of state responsibility. Jay Healy wrote a paper on where what level of involvement does the Russian intelligence services have with these Trickbot members? Not exactly laid out here, but regardless, I think a lot of us on the defensive side are always happy when someone is held accountable for cyber crimes. So interesting example there. And another chain analysis, folks, I say it wrong. A report just kind of breaking down those sanctions and the significance of those as well. So interesting to continue to look at the sanctions that happen and see if those have any kind of deterrent effect or not. Trickbot, I think, has kind of chilled out. Haven't really seen any Trickbot activity that I know of lately, but will they come back? Hard to say. And will the developers who've created Trickbot just move on to the next malware family? Interesting to keep an eye on that ecosystem. All right, one last thing I wanted to mention. This one a couple weeks old now, but you might recall, I think it was like on a Friday because it's always on a Friday. Some ESXi ransomware started popping up. We saw some tweets, and then eventually there was a name for this called ESXi ARGs. ESXi servers, right, hosting virtual infrastructure, huge target. And I think I saw someone tweeting that, like, if your ESXi server is directly connected to the internet, like, you're probably just going to get hosed. ESXi servers are particularly tough sometimes because a lot of traditional tools don't monitor them. This was a great post from Lindsay Kay about ESXi ransomware, because this is something that we've seen previous months and years as well, but it's sort of unique, right? And so once adversaries have access into ESXi servers, they can do all kinds of stuff, right? Create their own virtual machines, have pretty much free reign, and challenges there's not often great monitoring of these servers. So worth thinking about that. And though I think ESXi ARGs has died down a little bit, almost certainly there's going to be ransomware that affects ESXi in the future. So there is a script that CISA released, might be helpful if you were affected by this, to try to decrypt any data from that ransomware group. But again, thinking about in the future, how could you maybe not have your ESXi server face the internet? That would be a good thing. Patching, and I appreciate that the team at Rapid7 noted patching can be challenging and requires downtime. So thinking about for the next time ESXi ransomware pops up, how would you handle that? All right, well, we've hit a ton of topics today. Let's go ahead and just wrap up with some closing things. Let's see any questions that come in. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to highlight is a conference called SleuthCon that I'm on the board for, cyber criminal conference in the DC area. So kind of a fun one if you're interested in cybercrime. Call for submissions opens until late March. And then, of course, we have a ton of cybersecurity summits coming up from SANS. The CTI summit was last month, but we have a lot coming up that are free and online. So huge one. If anyone is new to cybersecurity, there's a new to cyber summit, totally free in like a little over 2 weeks. You can sign up virtually. Others that I wanted to highlight, we have calls for presentations open for the ransomware summit in particular. Talked a lot about ransomware today. If you have thoughts to share about the ransomware ecosystem, the team would love to see your proposals for that one. So as always, a lot of opportunities for different events. And of course, most of them are virtual and totally free online if you can't make it in person. Whew. All right. A lot going on. Thanks so much for joining today. Hopefully you got some tidbit that you can take away to enable defenders, make your networks a little safer, track those adversaries. So thanks so much for joining. Hope to see you in a future month. Take care.